Last night there was a service here in Brisbane that marked something of an adventure for the Anglican part of the Christian Church. That was the occasion which in the cathedral here women were first ordained into the priesthood. Now, for many people that's just a little piece of recent history, but for others that is quite a momentous thing. It's taken the best part of 2,000 years to get back to a circumstance of the first century or so of the church. For other parts of the church, for instance, the Quakers in the 1660s, there were women working in ministry there. Other parts of the Christian church are a long way from ever coming again to having the ordination of women. But I wanted to talk to two of the women involved in that, and I have with us Bishop Barbara Darling, who's the Assistant Bishop of Melbourne's Eastern Region. Good morning, Barbara.
Good morning.
Let me just give you a little bit more volume there. Thank you for making time to talk to us.
It's a pleasure.
And in the studio, Canon Marion Free is with us. Good morning, Marion.
Good morning, Phil.
Thanks for coming along.
My pleasure.
Let me take it from the top, I guess. First of all, Bishop, how do you reconcile being a Carlton supporter with Orthodox Christianity?
I have no problems at all with doing that.
Well, I don't know. There are some who would call that heresy, but we'll get beyond that. First, from your point of view, how have things developed in the last 20 years or so since in the Anglican Communion you first moved to ordaining women into the priesthood? Has there been a lot of change in that time?
Yes, there has, and I was able to speak about that a little bit last night at the cathedral. There were 6 women and 7 men that were ordained as priests in December 1992 at St John's Cathedral, and now there's 110 women and who are priests, and 20 women who are deacons who are serving in the Diocese of Brisbane. So in the last 20 years in Brisbane and in Melbourne and in many other places across Australia, there's many more women who have been ordained and are working in ministry in parishes, in schools, in hospitals and in other areas of ministry.
It's a very patchwork thing, it seems to me, across the wider Christian church, but also even within your own denomination. Now, looking at the National Church Life Survey, the Uniting Church around about 20% ordained women, the Salvation Army not far behind, between 8-10% for the Anglicans, and it goes down Churches of Christ, the Pentecostals, the Baptists, the Presbyterians. Does it vary throughout parts of Australia? Do you find that there are some parts of Australia where there is quite entrenched masculinity, if you like, and others that are more open to women in ministry?
Yes, we've got 23 dioceses across Australia, and most of them are in favour of women being both deaconed, which is the first stage of ordination, or being priested. But in Sydney, they are happy to have women ordained as deacons, but at this stage they are not yet prepared to have women ordained as priests. And they're one of our largest dioceses, and so it's quite obvious that with Sydney and with a couple of other dioceses, women are not welcome to be ordained as priests at this stage.
Is gender still the big issue of the 21st century, both in theological and in ecclesiastical terms? Is God a man, and what is the place for women in leadership of the church?
I think it's still one of the important issues. I don't think it's the only one, but many people are looking at who God is, and we believe that God embraces masculinity and femininity, and people are still working out what that means in their own theology. So, yes, during this last week I was heading a retreat for the clergy, some of the clergy of the diocese, and we were looking at issues of women of faith over the centuries and how even early on, back in the 13th century and earlier, people were talking about attributes of God that were feminine as well as masculine. And so it's something that we are exploring because we believe that we are made in the image of God, both male and female.
It's an interesting point, and also what the future of it may hold. I was just looking at some statistics, and in the United States, across denominations within the mainstream Christian churches, more than 50% now ordain women, and across the various theological training and seminary facilities, more than 30%, well more than a third of women make up the student numbers there. Bishop Barbara Darling with us, Assistant Bishop of Melbourne's Eastern Region, and Canon Dr. Marion Free with us here in the studio. Marion, good morning to you.
Good morning.
I was hoping we might explore with you some of the more personal part of the story. Mm-hmm. At the time that you felt a call on your life, if I can put it in those terms, how difficult was it for you to express that within a pretty much male-dominated circumstance and say, this is what I think where I ought to be going?
It was actually very difficult. I felt a sense of call when I was still living in New Zealand, which was interesting because in 1980 I had never seen a woman in the sanctuary, let alone as a priest. We came back to Brisbane and one just didn't know who to tell, because it's a very personal experience, so you're sharing your soul in a sense, but I also wasn't really sure where the church in Brisbane stood and to whom I could speak. Once I started to speak, it was obviously I was part of a movement and got a lot of support from the people who loved me and the people that wanted women to be ordained.
You said you're married?
Yes, I am married.
And how is that circumstance? Because traditionally, in all the movies, in all the books, in all that sort of stereotypical stuff, we have the canon, the priest, whomever, and his wife. And, of course, the role reversal within the parish that you're in.
Well, it's wonderful. I'd have to say I'm extraordinarily lucky. I'm married to someone who believes it's his vocation to support me. So in that sense, it's wonderful. And the children have grown up with it and have been, again, you can't do it unless your family is behind you. One of the advantages for Michael, my husband, is that there were no role models.
Yes.
And so he's been able to be very much his own person. He contributes. But while he can certainly cook at least as well, if not better than me, he's not expected to make cakes or be on Mother's Union. So he's forging, as I'm forging a different way of being in ministry, he's forging a different way of being a spouse.
Leadership within the church and this idea of ordination, and for people not of faith, it's a strange sort of a thing. In fact, it's not so much about your sense of call, but that the church and God calls you, and so there's a validation that doesn't necessarily have to do with corporate structures or legislation. It's a spiritual thing. Given that, do you ever come across, I suppose, either men or women who simply don't recognise that your life could be called in this direction, that you do have leadership authority simply because you're a woman and that's not on?
Probably not anymore. My experience since ordination has been very positive. I know there are still some people who do feel uncomfortable. In the parishes to which I've been called, I have been... my first parish, they were told to give me a go, and they did. And no one has ever left a parish I've been in. I've been truly blessed. But I do know some people are uncomfortable, and there are occasional difficult experience for women, but in the last few years I certainly would say I hadn't had any.
Canon Marion Free with us in the studio this morning, and Bishop Barbara Darling, the Assistant Bishop of Melbourne's Eastern region. Barbara, I look at the history and the recent circumstances even of Christian churches here in Australia, and for instance the Presbyterian Church in the 70s had moved to ordain women but then revoked that in the early 1990s. In the Baptist circumstance, it's very piecemeal here and there. The Roman Catholic Church seems not to want to talk about this at all. Where do you think the Australian Christian landscape could be in 5 to 10 years?
It's hard to say exactly. I know there are wonderful women within different denominations, within the Catholic Church, within the other denominations, who certainly are being used in ministry but not necessarily ordained at this stage. I hope and pray at some stage it may happen for those in the Catholic Church, but at the moment I don't think there's any possibility of that. With the Presbyterians, I know some of them were very much in favour, but then the organisation as a whole decided that they didn't want to have women moving forward to be ordained. So I'm not sure whether that will change, but certainly some of the other major denominations do have men and women equally in leadership and being ordained.
We're just marking basically 20 years since the first women to be ordained in the Anglican Communion. That service took place in the cathedral in Brisbane 20 years ago, and there was a celebration just last night. One final question that may be a little personal and at risk of stereotyping, but I want to ask it. Kinglake forms part of the eastern region that is within your area of service.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And considering the suffering and the extreme circumstances that community has been through, as a woman in leadership and pastoral care, do you feel that you were placed and particularly well qualified to deal with that in a way that maybe the more entrenched masculine aspect of church leadership might have been?
Well, first of all, I was not the bishop of the eastern region when we had the bushfires. There was a male who was the bishop then at that stage, and he did a fine job working with the local priest and helping in that area. I've continued on since then. Well, we still have not got the church rebuilt. We're trying to do that. The people who are in Kinglake really want to be able to have the church built there again. So we're trying to help them. I was able to go there for a confirmation service earlier this year, just at the same time as we had the memorial service for the 3 years of the bushfires. And it was wonderful to see that there was a sense of hope there, as well as lots of memories and sadness. So I don't think that it mattered whether or not the person in charge in leadership was male or female. I think that we can all have attributes of being there and trying to be there for people in times of need. And I think if I had been the person that was the bishop for that area at that time, I certainly would have done as much as I could have done, whether I was a male or a female. I don't think that's relevant at this stage for that question.
Thank you very much indeed. Bishop Barbara, Canon Marion, thank you very much for being available this morning. I do appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.